Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into Reconstruction today. More specifically, we're going to explore the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the battle for Black civil and political rights in the South after the Civil War. Honestly, going through these sources really struck me the speed of change. I mean, just a few years ago, slavery was the law of the land. Now we see Black men voting, holding office. It's a huge shift. What did this actually look like day to day? Did everyone embrace these changes?
It certainly wasn't a smooth transition. Yeah, your sources really capture both the hope and the backlash of this period. While there are these big achievements like the 15th Amendment giving Black men the right to vote, the fight for true equality was far from over.
And it wasn't just about laws changing, was it? Like these changes really impacted people's lives in a real way, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a really powerful example in one of your sources. It's a story about a Black cook in Natchez, Mississippi. She was assaulted by a white employer, and for the first time ever, she was able to go to court before a Black justice of the peace. So this really illustrates how Reconstruction literally changed who had the power. It makes me wonder, though, what was the reaction from the white community when they saw this shift? Your sources might have some insights on that.
That's a great point. It couldn't have been easy for people used to having all the power to just accept such a big change. And speaking of power, even within the Republican Party, it seemed like there were some disagreements about how to handle Reconstruction.
You're right. Even within the party that was pushing for Reconstruction, there were some internal struggles. One of the main things they argued about was redistributing land. Some Black Republicans were really passionate about helping formerly enslaved people get land. They saw that as essential, essential for economic independence. Like they believed you couldn't have true freedom without having some control over your own land.
That makes sense. Like, how do you really start over and rebuild your life if you don't even have land to work or to live on? So, what were the arguments against doing that, against land redistribution?
Well, a lot of white Republicans, even though they supported Black people voting, were kind of hesitant about these more radical changes. Some said it was the government overstepping its boundaries, and others worried about alienating Southern whites who were already resistant to the changes that were happening. This conflict within the Republican Party itself ended up having really long-lasting consequences and really limited the potential for Black Southerners to gain real economic power.
So even right from the start, we see this back and forth between those who wanted to completely change the South and those who wanted a more slow, maybe less disruptive approach. But then comes the backlash. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Redeemers appear. These weren't just individuals who were upset, right? They had a whole agenda.
Exactly. The Redeemers, they were mostly Southern Democrats, and their goal was to undo all the progress made during Reconstruction and bring back white supremacy. And the Klan, with their campaign of violence, became the way to do that.
Your sources really paint a horrifying picture of that violence. The lynching of Wyatt Outlaw in North Carolina and the brutal murder of Jim Williams in South Carolina. It's just hard to understand such cruelty.
And it's important to understand that these weren't just random acts. They were part of this strategy, a strategy of terror, to suppress Black political power and reinstate that old racial hierarchy. They targeted anyone who threatened that order.
Right.
Community leaders, voters, even teachers.
And Jim Williams, he was a former slave who became a captain in the Black militia. His story is especially tragic.
It really is. It's kind of a perfect example of both the hope and the reality of this time. He fought for the Union in the Civil War and then led this militia to protect his community. He even tried to make peace with the KKK, hoping for a peaceful solution.
What happened when he tried to do that?
Well, it ended terribly. His attempt at a truce with J. Rufus Bratton, a prominent doctor and KKK leader, fell apart, and Williams was murdered. Devastating for the community, and a reminder of the hate and the desire to hold on to white power.
The sources suggest his death was planned, that it was an act of terror after he refused to give up his militia's weapons.
You're exactly right. Your sources definitely point to this being planned. It was intended to crush any thought of armed resistance, a very clear message about who was really in control.
It's heartbreaking and infuriating, but all this violence, especially the assassination of Jim Williams, did cause a federal response, right? Like, this is when we see the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 come into play, right?
Yeah, you're right. The violence was escalating, and it forced the federal government to do something. The Enforcement Acts were passed in 1870 and 1871. They were meant to protect Black voters and stop the Klan, made it a crime to conspire to deny voting rights. The government could now step in when there was violence or intimidation. And then the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 went even further. It made it a federal crime to violate someone's civil and political rights.
This sounds like a huge step for the time. Was it actually effective? Did it work?
It was definitely a bold move. It shows how the federal government was starting to see its role in protecting black rights. It set a precedent for intervention against racial violence and is even considered a precursor to modern hate crime laws. But how effective it was is debatable. While it led to some convictions and violence did go down for a bit, it was hard to enforce, especially as the North started losing interest in Reconstruction.
So even with these new laws, it seems the tide was turning against Reconstruction. And the election in 1872, with the rise of the liberal Republican Party and their alliance with the Democrats, really shows that shift. It's a fascinating story, but also confusing.
Yeah, the 1872 election was a real turning point. The liberal Republicans were disillusioned with Grant's administration and what they saw as corruption in the South. So they joined forces with the Democrats and nominated Horace Greeley for president.
And Greeley's campaign slogan, "Clasp hands across the bloody chasm," really captures the feeling in the North, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah. It showed how much people wanted to move on from the Civil War. To heal the nation, even if it meant giving up on the promise of racial equality in the South. A lot of Northerners were just tired of the conflict, the expense, and it felt like Reconstruction wasn't working.
It is interesting, though, that even with this shift, Grant still won a huge victory.
And that's the ironic part. Grant winning might look like a sign that the commitment to Reconstruction was still strong. But the fact that Greeley's campaign existed at all and his ideas were so popular showed how weak that commitment really was.
It seems like Grant winning almost hid how much people were starting to go against Reconstruction. The sources you gave really show that difference between what the election said and what was really happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Grant's win might seem like it was good for Reconstruction, but it doesn't show everything. In fact, while Grant was celebrating his victory, a horrible event was unfolding in Colfax, Louisiana. That event really shows how fragile the peace was, and it sort of hints at the violence that was coming.
This brings us to that Colfax massacre you talked about earlier, a really awful event. Can you tell us what happened? Like, what caused this explosion of violence?
Well, it all started with an election in 1872 that was disputed. Both the Republican and the Democrat said they'd won the race for Grant Parish Sheriff. And that made things really tense. Armed groups started forming on both sides.
So there were these two groups, both armed and totally divided along racial lines, facing off against each other. Sounds like it was going to be a disaster.
And it was. Yeah, on Easter Sunday, 1873, a white militia, mostly made up of former Confederate soldiers and members of the Ku Klux Klan, attacked the courthouse in Colfax. The courthouse was being defended by a black militia.
Easter Sunday. That seems significant, doesn't it?
Yeah, the timing wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a political fight. It was a deliberate act of racial terror. They wanted to send a message. The white attackers were determined to take back power and show they were in control, even if it meant using extreme violence.
What happened in the attack?
Well, the Colfax massacre ended up with somewhere between 60 and 150 black men killed, while only 3 white men died. The exact number is still debated, but the amount of violence is clear.
That's a staggering number of deaths. It's hard to believe that something so horrible could happen, just a few years after the Civil War and slavery supposedly ending.
It just shows how strong the resistance to black freedom and equality was. And the Colfax massacre wasn't the only one. Similar violence broke out all across the South during this time. White Southerners were trying to bring back the old way of life and stop black people from getting political and economic power.
It seems clear the government wasn't really committed to protecting black rights anymore. What happened after the Colfax massacre? Were there any consequences for something so brutal?
Well, they tried to take legal action, but it didn't really work. Federal authorities did arrest a lot of the white men involved, but only 3 were found guilty. And the Supreme Court overturned their convictions very quickly.
So there was no justice for the victims and their families?
No, not really.
Yeah.
And this lack of accountability sent a message. That black lives didn't matter. It made white supremacists even bolder and undermined the progress made during Reconstruction, which was already fragile.
So you have the violence increasing, and then on top of that, the country was hit with a terrible economic crisis in 1873. The Panic of 1873, they call it. It must have had a huge effect on Reconstruction.
Yeah, the timing was awful.
Yeah.
The Depression made everyone focus on the economy and not on the South. Northerners were already tired of the problems in the South, and then they became even less willing to support Reconstruction.
So it was a lot of things happening all at once. The North getting tired of Reconstruction, the racial violence getting worse, and then a big economic crisis that took away attention and resources. Seems like the perfect situation for those who wanted to destroy the progress that had been made.
Exactly. All of that created an opportunity for the Democrats, the party that was mostly against Reconstruction, to get back their power in the South. They used the economic worries and the racism of white voters. They promised to bring back order and stability, but at the cost of black
And
rights.
they were successful, right?
They were.
Yeah.
In the 1870s, the Democrats won a lot of state elections across the South. They used a lot of different ways to do this: voter intimidation, fraud, and even making laws that took away the right to vote from black citizens.
That's awful.
Yeah.
All that progress made during Reconstruction, the hope for real equality and a democracy that included everyone, seemed to just disappear. Did the fight for black rights just end there?
Well, Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, but the fight for equality didn't. Even with the government pulling back its support and the South going into the Jim Crow era, black communities continued to fight against the oppression. They kept fighting for their rights.
So even though there were setbacks and white supremacy came back in the South, there was still hope, the belief that the fight could continue. It's amazing to think about how resilient those were who kept pushing for equality, even when things were so bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Reconstruction might not have reached its full potential, but it did plant the seeds for progress later on. The 14th and 15th Amendments, even though they weren't really being enforced, were still part of the Constitution. They gave a legal basis for future fights. And maybe most importantly, the spirit of resistance, the unwavering belief that things could get better. That stayed alive in black communities. It laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would come later on.
That's a really important point. Reconstruction might have failed to do everything it was supposed to do, but it did start things that would lead to progress later on.
What about the Ku Klux Klan, though? Their story doesn't just end there, right? What happened to them after Reconstruction?
That's something we'll talk about in part 3. The Klan story actually takes a surprising turn in the early 20th century. There's a resurgence, and it's driven by social anxieties and a new powerful form of media film.
So we've been discussing the decline of Reconstruction and then the return of violence and oppression in the South. But you were saying that the Ku Klux Klan story goes in a surprising direction. So what happened? Did they just disappear?
Well, not really. They lost some power right after Reconstruction, but they didn't actually go away. In fact, they had this resurgence in the early 1900s, and it was fueled by a couple things. One was social anxieties, and the other was this new, powerful medium, film.
Now, that's interesting. How did film help the Klan come back? Okay, so picture this. It's 1915, and this movie comes out called The Birth of a Nation, and it becomes this huge cultural phenomenon. But here's the thing. It actually glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, makes them out to be these heroes, protecting white Southern women from the threat of black men.
A film praising the KKK. That's crazy. Was this just some small production, or did people actually like it?
It's hard to imagine now, but this film was super popular. Even President Woodrow Wilson endorsed it, and it really influenced how people saw the Klan. Definitely contributed to their comeback.
Wow, that really shows how powerful propaganda can be, especially when it plays on people's prejudices. But this wasn't the same old Klan, was it? You mentioned something about them being more organized and appealing to more people.
You're right. This wasn't just a bunch of former Confederates hiding out anymore. This new Klan, one influenced by that messed up story in The Birth of a Nation, was way more organized, and they had a much wider reach.
So they weren't just targeting black people anymore.
Nope. They went after Catholics, Jews, immigrants, anyone they thought was a danger to their idea of a white Protestant America. They used all those anxieties about immigration and cities growing and social change happening in the country at that time.
So basically they turned fear of anyone different into a weapon, something that unfortunately still happens today. But how did they go from this small group to this big organization?
They were very good at making themselves look like they were protecting traditional values and morality. They had rallies and parades, even picnics, made them seem less like a hate group and more like a club. They also got into local governments and police departments and even schools.
The Klan in positions of power, that's terrifying.
It is. And by the 1920s, the Klan had millions of members across the country. They weren't just in the South anymore. They were in the North and the West, too. It wasn't a regional thing. It was a national one.
So the idea that the Klan was only a Southern thing isn't true.
Not at all. When they came back in the early 20th century, it showed a lot more people agreed with their hateful ideas than we thought.
This is a scary reminder that prejudice and bigotry can be anywhere, anytime. But this couldn't have gone on forever, right? People had to start pushing back.
They did. By the late 1920s, the Klan started losing popularity. There were scandals with their leaders, power struggles within the group, and more people speaking out against them. All of that contributed to their downfall.
So they kind of destroyed themselves.
In a way, yes. But their ideas didn't go away completely. They'd pop up again in different ways throughout the 1900s, usually whenever there was big social change happening, like during the Civil Rights Movement.
It's like a virus. It goes quiet, but it's never truly gone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The Klan might not be as powerful as it once was, but its symbols and its language and its history of hate still exist in extremist groups and movements today.
It's disturbing, but we have to remember that this isn't just history. It's connected to what's happening now.
Exactly. We need to understand the history of the Klan and what allowed them to get so strong. That's how we fight racism and intolerance in all forms. We have to be aware of these ideologies and challenge them wherever we see them.
So after all this discussion about Reconstruction and the Ku Klux Klan, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's this. The fight for equality never ends. It's something we all have to be part of, whether we know it or not. We can't just sit back and think that the progress we've made is permanent. We have to be involved in this fight, challenge injustice, and protect everyone's rights.
That's a great point to end on. We've gone from the hope of Reconstruction to the rise of the KKK, and ultimately to the understanding that the fight for equality is ongoing.
It's been a tough but important conversation. And even though looking at the past can be hard, understanding it is the only way we can build a future that's more fair and just for everyone.
Thank you for taking us through this complicated and difficult topic. And to our listeners, thank you for being here with us for this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring these ideas and find ways to make your own voices heard in the fight for a better world.